Okay, so good day to you all, and welcome to this session of Friends of Multilateralism group in Geneva, and this high-level dialogue on the future of WTO reform. We have been doing this initiative for quite a few months, and we have invited former Director General, former ministers from various member states of the WTO to share their independent insights on the future of the WTO and various kind of challenges facing it. And we discussed, and we think it will be important also to hear from the private sector. So that's why we have Andrew and ICC with us. So I won't make any further ado, but give floor immediate to Hamid, who will kindly moderate this. Hamid, back to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lou. I think this session comes at a very timely point in time, and let me start by thanking Andrew for joining us for this opportunity to unpack a very complicated picture that we see before us. And let me introduce Andrew first. Andrew Wilson is the Deputy Secretary General of ICC. And Andrew has been a long travel companion for ICC over many years in different capacities, focusing on trade policy and investment and on other matters as well of concern to ICC. But also not just diversity of roles and substances, but geographical focus. So he has served ICC in New York, in London, in Paris, and I think he has a rounded experience, which makes it a really interesting opportunity for us to have this dialogue with him today. So thank you very much, Andrew, for making the time. And let me start by asking you a broad question, which I would want to invite you to expand on it and give us your thoughts and share your insights. Now, we look at the rules-based system, and we can see that this rules-based order is under unprecedented and visible threat. Everybody's talking about that now. Whether it's trade tensions, industrial policy races, climate measures, or political rivalry, all these factors and more are basically pulling the system apart. At the time now when many actors on the trade and investment field, and particularly in Geneva, are increasingly resigned to what's happening, ICC has just issued a call for action, trying to sort of provide not just a wake-up call, but basically saying that, look, now is the time to act. It's becoming urgent, and it's becoming a lot more serious than before. Why is business still so keen on having a functioning WTO? What is your justification for why is the system still worth fighting for? So, Andrew, please go ahead.
Big question straight after lunch, but I will do my best, Hamid, and thank you for the very kind introduction. I think this has been an interesting year, and just on the issue of why does business think the system is still worth fighting for, which I think is an interesting place to start. I've been at ICC, as you kind of alluded to, for almost 20 years, despite my very youthful looks. And what's been interesting over that time, if I now look back after the experience of this year, is the way in which business has generally engaged with the WTO, or with the WTO versus other trade processes. And I think if you kind of characterize that 17, 18-year period when I've been at ICC, for the most part, business, I think, and I probably wouldn't say this in a more public setting, but I think it's fair to say business has taken the multilateral system up until this year largely for granted. And obviously there are some outliers and different approaches, but I think if you take the majority of our membership, the WTO has been there. It's not really been seen as the place where the action is happening. We've often faced criticism from companies who have said to us, you're placing too much emphasis on Geneva and the WTO rather than where the action is in all of these bilateral agreements. And kind of, if I look back over the period I've been with ICC, you see different sort of peaks of interest in different processes. 1 year or 2 years, it could be ASEAN, then it's the TTIP agreement, then it's something else. But generally, I think the WTO has been an afterthought, and as I say, taken for granted. And I also think, and this is partly a personal self-reflection, too many of us in the trade policy space, certainly from a private sector perspective, have been too quick to talk down the WTO. So often people like myself will show up to panels at the WTO and say, the rules are out of date, they were conceived before the internet, it's shambolic that we haven't had a successful all-encompassing trade round in X number of years, etc., etc., etc. I think you're all familiar with that narrative. I say all of that not as sort of a historical take on my tenure with ICC, but rather to say what's been interesting this year is to see the shift in emphasis of companies at a pretty significant scale. So certainly there's been a reflection due to the tariff turbulence that actually this multilateral system, the WTO, embodies or underpins, if you like, is remarkably important. And I'm struck by one conversation that was recounted to me of head of trade talking to a CEO, having to explain why MFN actually matters, and basically saying, if we don't have MFN, tariff schedules are going to get very, very difficult to navigate. So this thing is important and it's absolutely worth preserving. And I think that's almost been the realization or the awakening we've seen more broadly within our network this year, that there are elements of the system that are hidden, whether it's SPS, TBT, the valuation agreement, TRIPS even, that are absolutely worth preserving. And what we see now, I think, from our network is a real desire to stand up, not necessarily independently as individual companies, but through organizations like ICC, through national organizations and sectoral bodies, to make the case for the defense of the system. And you'll see in our call to action, one of the first recommendations is for a standstill on trade restrictive measures. So the message is, please do for no further harm, but also to really see if this is an opportunity through the turbulence that has been created largely by the US tariffs, to see if there is a new political pathway to modernize or reform the system. And I think there is real appetite for that. And I think the other thing that is part of this awakening is not just the underlying value of the system or the enduring value of the system, but also a recognition that there are issues that can only be solved multilaterally, including many of the tensions and frictions that have underpinned some of the US tariff moves. That's not to justify them in our opinion, but to say there are issues that need multilateral solutions from a business perspective. And I think the other thing is to say, businesses have invested a huge amount of time in different bilateral negotiations that often haven't delivered as much as was promised, either because the negotiations have failed, I mentioned TTIP earlier, or the benefits from those agreements has been slow to accrue. And that's certainly the case for SMEs, I think, when you talk about free trade agreements. So I think there's also a degree of recognition that free trade agenda, the bilateral trade agenda, will remain important, but actually there is a bigger multilateral system and a potential prize there. So that's really the thinking and the logic. And I think, you'll have all seen probably at the WTO Public Forum this September, there was the biggest ever turnout from the business community. And that is, I think, a very visible reflection of what we're seeing in our membership in terms of the growing interest in the WTO and really the desire not just to support and preserve a very, very valuable and important system, but also look at and see whether there's an opportunity to push forward with a positive reform round that's truly responsive to business needs. Hamid, I think you're on mute.
You're absolutely right. Thanks. It's very interesting what you're saying about the mindset shift from looking at the WTO as something that is like an engine quietly humming for the past 30 years. And now, perhaps with what the U.S. is doing and all the measures taken, tariffs, of course, is creating a lot of heartburn. But there is a renewed realization among the business community that there is a need for a rules-based system, and I think maybe President Trump is doing the system a favor by providing this kind of wake-up call. But I was also interested in what you said, Andrew, just now about the extent to which SMEs have seen RTAs and regional agreements as beneficial to them. And that is, I think, perhaps is an interesting angle that we have not discussed extensively before. But if you can add any kind of explanation to that or expand on that, because I think that's a very, very valuable point to understand now, particularly at a time when everybody's talking about how can we empower SMEs to expand their opportunities. So please go ahead.
So this is based, I should just give kind of a health warning on this. This is based largely on anecdotal evidence from our network. So ICC national affiliates, chambers of commerce. There is also a little bit of data that seems to support what I think our conclusion is on FTAs and PTAs. And that is specifically that SMEs find them very difficult to utilize and navigate. So really, what we often hear is SMEs can't necessarily understand what tariff rate should apply under an FTA or a PTA. They may not be aware of the existence of the agreement in many cases, so there's essentially a capacity gap. And if they're exporting to multiple countries, the compliance burden of calculating the different tariff rates under different agreements may be too much, so they default often to the MFN rate. I'm aware of some research that sadly is no longer on the internet from the National Board of Trade in Sweden that estimated that 80% of SMEs, when they trade internationally, do not use the EU's bilateral trade agreements. I don't know where that piece of research disappeared to or why, but that was an interesting reference point. And it's kind of been interesting to see the British Chambers of Commerce in the UK press the last few weeks saying, great that the UK government is out negotiating bilateral trade agreements with India, Singapore, etc. But if they want these things to be usable by business at the grassroots, if you like, by small businesses, then the government also needs to invest significantly in trade capacity building. So I think there is a gap there, and I think generally what we hear is people default to MFN because the complexity of the kind of bilateral free trade agreement environment is either too complex or they don't know which agreements exist or what tariff rates should apply.
I think that's a terribly interesting point, I think, to be expanded upon in the future, because it relates to another phenomena that we've heard about so much, which is the problem of regulatory diversity across jurisdictions and how that really increases compliance costs for SMEs. Well, thank you very much. This is most interesting and enlightening. Now, a follow-up question here, just to feed into the broader picture, going a bit beyond trade. From where you sit, where you oversee ICC's entire policy portfolio, is the loss of momentum we are seeing today on the trade front or in the WTO, is this part of a wider breakdown in multilateral cooperation across institutions or across different policy areas? In other words, from where you're sitting, how do you see the wider picture when it comes to that?
So I think, and we've done a lot of reflection on this, I think, over the past year. In fact, over the past several years, this is not just a challenge, I think, that has occurred as a result of some of the positions taken by the current US administration. But I think it's very easy to talk down the system and to say multilateralism is failing or it's somehow on life support or close to death. And if you're wanting to create that narrative, and I know there are many people who like to, certainly in the media, it's very easy to take certain kind of proof points or supposed evidence and create that sort of picture. I frankly think that is incorrect, or it often results from cherry picking or unrealistic expectations. So just to give you a couple of short examples, I think the first thing is, we live in a 24/7 media environment where I think timelines or expectations have become infinitely shorter. So we kind of, I think, in terms of certainly sort of broader public opinion or maybe even government opinion, sometimes go into major international conferences, summits, etc., with unreasonable expectations in terms of what can be achieved. The annual climate COP, for instance, there's an expectation that there's going to be some big bang announcement or major advancement. I think the history of multilateralism, if you look over the last, 70 plus years, is partly one of incrementalism in the main. And I think we need to be really careful in terms of the expectations we have on what processes deliver and when. That's not to say in relation to the WTO, we would be happy with an open-ended reform process that goes on for another 10, 20 years. But to say that, we can't expect the multilateral system to deliver big bang agreements every month or every 6 months or even every year. So I think expectations is one thing where there needs to be a degree of recalibration. The other thing I would say that is more positive than what you typically hear in the media or even from some governments is a lot of technical work continues to be done by multilateral organizations that is immensely beneficial to the real economy. So thinking of is in the trade space, but the World Customs Organization continues to function pretty well from our perspective. There are various technical conventions. There was a convention conference in Geneva just a few weeks ago on the phase out of mercury, for instance. And I think we see at that kind of apolitical, more technical level, continued life in the system and continued value from it. Obviously, where there are challenges is where there are higher stakes, more political issues. Climate is certainly one of those. But I think even if you look at the outcome to Belém, it may have disappointed many people in terms of the overall outcome, the level of ambition, which comes back to my earlier point in part about unrealistic expectations. But it did succeed in moving the needle on a few small, more technical issues. And it also kept the international community together behind what, from our perspective, is a very important convention. So I don't totally buy the idea that multilateralism has lost all of its vigor or is on life support. Sure, there are difficulties. Sure, progress may not be as expeditious as many of us would want, but it continues to function and perform a very, very vital role. And I think we talk it down, frankly, at our peril. And I think certainly I think ICC and other organizations like us have a very important role to play in terms of championing the system, obviously demanding governments step up and deliver outcomes, but certainly not dismissing the system or suggesting that we tear it up and start all over again.
Well, I really applaud your balanced view of what's going out there. I mean, I completely agree with you that expectations are sometimes unrealistic, but I would also add that those expectations are always influenced by the rising challenges. Because, and I think there is a bit of legitimacy to those expectations in the face of those challenges, because multilateral institutions and the multilateral system has been built for a cause, for a purpose, and those challenges come challenging that purpose and the expectation that the institutions would respond accordingly and effectively is a legitimate expectation. Now, of course, it's a lot more complicated than that, so you can't, turn around the situation overnight. But thank you very much for your insights, Andrew. Let me open the floor now for questions or comments from our colleagues online. Any hands up? Okay. Lou, please go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Hamid, and thanks to Andrew for a really great presentation. Now, I just got a quick question. Probably, I mean, at least in our group we have discussed, but I'm not sure whether Andrew and also your member companies have discussed this also. Vis-a-vis WTO, the private sector does not have any systemic mechanism to interact with the WTO members and to present its views, as you have just said. And there have been some efforts by new DG and this so-called advisory board, but it is probably not what we experts think it should be. It should be more kind of regular, systemic, more robust thing. And what do you think companies would like to have in the WTO or with the WTO for the way forward on WTO reform?
So look, I think it's a great question. Thank you, Lou. And I probably should have covered it in my initial remarks when I was describing the call to action, because that's one of the issues we really major on. I think just in terms of the Director General's Business Advisory Council, we see it as a welcome move. It's a useful forum, I think, for strategic discussion with the Director General. Hopefully a useful channel she can use to mobilize business networks, certainly ahead of MC14 next year. But talking very openly and frankly, and I would get into deep trouble if this was ever to be made public, but we don't see it as the right configuration or the complete configuration of the business engagement in an effective way in the WTO system. And there are a couple of points that I think are worth really kind of emphasizing. The first is, if you look at the multilateral system, in many ways, the WTO is a strange outlier. So in the WCO, for instance, the World Customs Organization, There's a private sector advisory group, but also ICC has observer status in a number of the different technical committees. So we can actually bring business expertise into the technical work of the World Customs Organization with very strict guardrails, of course, and we're absolutely respectful of that. But you have that channel. Even in the United Nations system, we have observer status in the General Assembly, which gives us access into a number of different negotiations, processes, treaty negotiations, for instance. And then even in a process that in some ways has kind of been skeptical up to a point of corporate interest, the UN climate process, the UNFCCC, there's a constituency system that brings in businesses and other civil society groups, workers, etc., in a very structured, tangible way, allowing access into the negotiations, but allowing also the negotiators to draw on expertise from those different constituencies. So the question we have perpetually, or the question I'm often asked by people is, why doesn't the WTO have something similar, given the importance of the system and the rules to the global business community? And we would see tremendous value in having some kind of structured role for the business community, of course, with appropriate parameters in any future modernization or reform process. So how can governments test different ideas or potentially calibrate possible rule changes or additions to the rulebook? But also on an ongoing basis, how do you bring, there's immense value, we know this in the WTO committees in terms of monitoring, transparency, etc. How can you bring business in a more structured way to avail the process or avail the system of insights, expertise, real world experience from the business community? And we think that is a deficit within the system that can be easily plugged. We know there will be some concerns about undue influence, etc. We think with effective governance and effective guardrails, that can be dealt with. And I think if you look at an issue like industrial policy, how can you possibly craft effective rules or disciplines, or even understand what is happening in the real economy in some jurisdictions without speaking in a very detailed technical way to businesses on the ground? So certainly is something we think is very, very important and really deserves proper attention. And it's great to hear that this group has been giving some thought to that, because it is a clear deficiency in the system. And I think the WTO will be much stronger. And it will also give, going back to what I was saying earlier about the sort of fluctuation in corporate interest in the multilateral system, if you like, it would give business a permanent channel that it could plug into to maintain interest in, support for, and engagement with the system.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. I think this is, and thank you, Lou, for bringing this up, because I think this is one of the central points now between the WTO and private sector organizations, including, of course, ICC, which is in many of the subjects that are being negotiated now, or even deliberated within the deliberative function, there is always a need for a reality check in terms of the relevance of what's being discussed inside the WTO to how business is done on a day-to-day basis. I can relate to this in the most practical way possible. Throughout, the past history of the WTO on trade and services, where there was no way, for example, to have a proper conversation about how do we put together some guidelines for domestic regulation on the accountancy profession without being in touch continuously on a step-by-step basis with the International Federation of Accountants and with the people who are actually doing business on the ground, so that we can be sure that whatever we do is actually relevant to the day-to-day concerns. Now, this is the the jury is still out about what kind of structured approach can be adopted for this kind of ongoing collaboration within the WTO. Because there's the other side, of course, that says, well, the WTO is a bit different from other organizations in the sense that this is a treaty system, and how do you integrate that role within the functions of the organization? But personally, I think there is room for having some kind of a structured approach within the deliberative function of the WTO. Certainly not the negotiating function nor the dispute settlement function. And this is perhaps one of the institutional issues on the agenda of reform that I'm sure members would be interested to pursue. I see now Stuart Harvinson. Please, Stuart, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Hamid. And I wasn't going to take the floor, but since we don't seem to have too many hands up at present, I thought I would venture forward. Very nice to see you, Andrew, and thank you very much for sparing your time with us today. I haven't managed, of course, to study the documents that we're talking about, the call for action and the other document, but they are quite short, so hopefully I'll be able to to absorb them fairly quickly. My comments are a little unfair, actually, I think. This is not meant as any sort of criticism of the ICC in particular, but I mean, the call for action, I took a look at that. It reads a little bit like a submission to the General Council, frankly. I mean, maybe what the WTO needs right now is some sort of very, very concrete business proposals and interest. I say, no, I appreciate this is totally unfair because, I mean, the ICC is a global organization and you probably have to have a massive negotiation internally before you even come up with this. So, I fully understand that, but I'm just, this is not really a comment directed at the ICC because, the nature of the beast is as it is, and you do your very, very best with that. But I'm just saying that it would be great if also the WTO could get more concrete input from business, I think, sometimes. So that's just one point. The other point, I mean, on this question of engagement between the WTO and business, frankly, I'm a bit skeptical about, creating structures and pathways and all of that sort of thing. In the UN, of course, you have all of that apparatus, and it's very exclusionary. I mean, if you're on the inside, of course, it's great, but if you're on the outside, if you don't have any standing with the UN, then they won't touch you. They won't go anywhere near you. Whereas in the WTO, you can roll up to the public forum or wherever, and people in the Secretariat will talk to you. They'll engage with you on a very informal basis. And I think that's more valuable, frankly, than setting up boards and advisory committees and all of that sort of stuff. And it means that individual companies can have meaningful conversations with delegates and with the Secretariat. So these are kind of two sort of off-the-wall comments. I'm sorry if I haven't kind of hit the button there, but I just thought I'd throw them in anyway. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Stuart. I just to back you up on what you said on your second point regarding collaboration with the private sector. I think we used to do that as a matter of day-to-day practice. It's just that the political environment and the politics within the WTO circle has changed since. If that can go back to where it was, that would be wonderful, and that actually was a lot more effective than formal processes for collaboration. I've lived that through years and years, and it worked wonderfully well. But we even used to invite private sector organizations to make statements and make presentations at formal bodies on an ad hoc basis. So it was, and I think, Stuart, when you were chairing, WTO bodies in the old days, and you would remember, at least on the services side, we used to invite private sector organizations to make submissions, and members would welcome that. So anyway, but that's something I think that would need to be subject to a lot of sort of diplomatic and political comfort levels, reaching the right level as well. I see. Sorry, Andrew. Would you like any comments on Stuart's points?
I've got many. It's great to see you again, Stuart. By the way, it's been too long. Maybe we take Deb's comment or questions, and then I could quickly respond to both.
Okay, Debbie, please go ahead.
Sorry, thanks very much. I wasn't going to comment because I'm sitting in a hotel room in Jakarta. But I was thinking about how do you get business input? And I was just going to flag for people to think about the ability of the APEC process. In particular, ASEAN has something parallel, which is there's a business advisory council. And in the APEC process, every member has the ability to nominate 3 companies or to take 3 companies. How they do that is entirely up to them. But the Business Advisory Council for APEC runs in parallel with the APEC meeting. They have their own set of agenda issues. They have their own set of meetings that aren't actually lined up necessarily with the main government meeting until the end, in which the Advisory Council for Business has the opportunity to provide formal feedback to the ministers and to the leaders. And what I think has been very valuable about that, and what firms always talk about, is the ability to think collectively as the 21 economies in APEC about what are the business challenges that could be resolved, but also to put together projects and programs and run a sort of parallel process to this, which I think is an interesting reminder that the business community is actually interested in these trade arrangements, that they do have something to say, that they can put together business suggestions and input, that at the end of the day, I mean, somehow we seem to forget this all the time, at least I find on many of these FMG calls, that the point of all of this is to create rules that businesses use. And if businesses aren't interested and aren't using the rules, then we've missed the point, in my view, of the World Trade Organization. And so I'm just as a helpful reminder, in my view, is like this is not an unusual thing. It doesn't need to be super complicated. The members could agree to it. And the business community does have something to say. Now, that does not, my last point, and I apologize for taking the microphone for quite so long, but the business community APEC process and the ASEAN process both do struggle with getting small businesses to participate because there's no payoff for small businesses to do so. But I think it's an interesting, at least it's an attempt to provide a framework that supports the kind of organization. And I just want to call out the ICC in particular and their trade agenda that they're putting together, or at least the call for action that they put together to remind governments, crucially, that business input is necessary. And it can't just be a side thought, and it can't just be done on the, sort of when they feel like it or whenever a business rocks up in Geneva. That's the wrong time to be getting business input. And so I just wanted to say there are other ways to do this. Happy to see the ICC continue to push on this issue and to try to think harder about how do we make sure that that business engagement is less ad hoc, becomes a bit more formalized, and a bit more of an opportunity for input to be received by the members in the WTO. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Debbie. Points well taken. Andrew?
Excellent. Well, thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Stuart. So maybe picking up partly on what Deborah said, but going back to kind of the core of Stuart's argument, which I think is a necessary reflection, right? What works in the system today? What could you lose? And what approaches don't work? And certainly there are downsides to some of the structures that the United Nations has, the ECOSOC status, etc., which is incredibly cumbersome. And frankly, not necessarily from our immediate experience, but from the experience of organizations within our network, can't make the UN system, or at least parts of the UN system, difficult to navigate or plug into. I think from our perspective, and I think it really goes back to what Deb was saying, is you don't want in any reform in relation to the engagement of the business community, you don't want to lose the good things that the system has already, that ability for ad hoc or informal exchanges up to a point, certainly not the public forum. But the key thing for us is how do you create a channel through whatever structure is appropriate that allows for engagement in the technical day-to-day work of the WTO, where businesses feel today that they don't have sufficient visibility or opportunity to engage, and where could that be of value to the system and to governments. And I think, you're right to point to the risk of structures becoming bureaucratic or exclusionary, but to the point Deb makes, which I think is very, very important, there is a risk of ad hoc engagement. So I've seen WTO processes, I'm trying to say this as generally as possible so as not to point the finger based on personal views, but I've seen processes invite individual companies into meetings without thinking through, does that company have the right expertise and what are they aiming at? And the result is you get policy-related discussions, let's say on circular economy, that have a very particular direction. So actually having some kind of structure or some kind of way of filtering who engages and how, I think is of ultimate value to the system. And I think there are, at least from our experience, real downside risks of allowing sort of ad hoc patterns of engagement, cherry picking, and also the risk that those that just turn up ultimately have the kind of loudest or the only voice. So I think it is worth thinking kind of structurally. And just on the call to action, it's intended as one document that has really broad, serious support from the business community that has been very carefully worked over in terms of the messaging and the delivery. But we will be looking as we move forward to MC14 and beyond at other possible interventions. So, if you or others on the call see opportunities for us to engage or deliver a certain type of content, we're absolutely open to that. And MC14 for us is priority number one heading into 2026.
I think your last point is very important, Andrew, which is basically the looking at this huge agenda. There's so much to unpack here, and there would be a need, I think, between now and MC14 for a lot of informative activities to bring the information to the right constituencies so that things can move forward. And of course, at the end of the day, I agree with what Deborah said about of course, the private sector and business community are the end users of whatever rules and whatever we agree on in negotiations. But they also need to address their own governments in their capitals in order to move the needle here in the WTO and in the negotiations leading to MC14. And you're right. Between now and then, there has to be the right kind of advocacy and informative activities to take place. So, further questions, Lou?
Yeah,
please.
yeah. Hamid, thanks. Since nobody else is raising their hands, so I would just abuse a little bit by raising another question, quite specific. I would say that probably Andrew and ICC, maybe you have not, how to say, done any specific survey on that, but I just want to have your feeling by talking to the companies. I mean, right now on the way forward on WTO reform, there are many things, sticking points here, which handicap the progress. I mean, just for example, let's say on the decision making, we got some members as said by other members, kind of applying very rigidly the consensus and then blocking other like-minded members, a smaller group of members, to move ahead on climate change, on investment facilitation, and so on and so forth in a plurilateral format. And then we also see some other major players more shifting towards kind of, in their words, more reciprocal New World Order and more kind of in their own interests for their own workers. But in the eyes of other members, violating basically the pure rules like MFN, tariff binding, so on and so forth. I mean, I do not mean to finger point anyone here, but my point is that have you or ICC talked to the companies in those countries, and what are their views on their government's position and on the way forward? I mean, just tell us how you feel about that, or if not, no worries. Yeah, I just want to understand the private sector in those countries, how they react to that. Thank you.
Okay. I think I know the countries you're referring to, by and large. So without naming them, yes, we do talk to and work with companies, mainly relatively large multinationals in those jurisdictions. The interest in safeguarding the system and ultimately strengthening it is no different to the kind of bigger global picture that I was describing earlier. So, for instance, I may as well say, because we all know what we're talking about, the US business community, although not vocal on WTO multilateralism, in our dealings with them, similar on climate issues, for instance, is very interested in measures that can be taken to strengthen the system. Now, that doesn't mean they may not be nuanced in the approach on certain things, whether it's on an issue like MFN, or whether it's on the future of industrial policy, or issues around export controls. We see nuances, I think, sectorally and geographically, but in big picture terms, there's interest in safeguarding the system, realization of the severe impacts it would have operationally and economically if the system was to suddenly collapse or to continue to erode. And there's really strong interest in reform, and partly the call to action is a way of kind of channeling that sentiment from the business community writ large. On the issue of consensus, I honestly think this is one of the issues that has done the most damage to the WTO's perception with the business community prior to this year, the sense that you just can't get things through the multilateral system, so why would you invest effort? And I remember speaking to a bunch of US tech companies 10 years ago, probably at the start of the discussions around the JSI, and they're saying, well, is it really worth it? Will the WTO be able to deliver? So then when you get to kind of an endpoint or an initial endpoint, and the thing can't be integrated into the system because one member has objected, that is not good for the system's credibility. And I think what we hear very clearly, consistently across the business community, is a desire for a much more effective decision-making process within the WTO. And really the ability for some kind of variable geometry within the system where coalitions of like-minded governments can go ahead, set standards. But I think the key thing from a global business perspective is those agreements should be open and other countries should be able to join over time. But I think on the point on decision-making, there would be very, very strong support from business. And we will certainly articulate this in the lead up to MC14 for something that does allow for greater flexibility and allows coalitions to proceed in particular areas with open plurilateral agreements as part of the system.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. I do have a question which relates to what we're discussing now, and this is the sentiment among the business community regarding how necessary it is to have a rules-based system as opposed to a power-based system. And a rules-based system that provides the predictability and stability in trade and investment conditions, which would be the sound basis for investment decisions. Now, the reason why I'm asking that question is that if the business community in different capitals, particularly capitals who do have influence on how the system is going forward, have that as a priority in the mind, then they would need to tell their governments that it is imperative that we have that instead of having the situation where we're in now, where the system is eroding and rules are going to be increasingly disregarded, and therefore the price is very high to pay. Now, why is that important now? In my view, it's because there's a political decision here that needs to be taken by policymakers in capitals. Do you want a rules-based system? There's a yes or no answer here. And if the answer is yes, then okay, what are you going to do about it? Because the only logical way to go, in my view, is to have a reformed WTO, not to scrap the WTO completely and go on a blank piece of paper and try to establish a new one, because the infrastructure that we have in this place, institutional, legal, and everything else, is something that I don't think we will be able to create anything like it within the next 2 generations. So that political choice, that fork in the road, I think now is the time in the run-up to MC14. So any insights on that, Andrew, would be wonderful.
A big question to end the webinar with only 5 minutes left, but I think the answer is pretty clear from a business perspective. And I think the lesson of this year when we talk to businesses, and the key message we get individually when we speak to businesses one-on-one from different jurisdictions, but it's also very clear in the numerous pulse surveys or network surveys we've done this year, is the principal product or the primary product from a power-based approach to international trade is massive uncertainty. That uncertainty has been hugely corrosive throughout the business community. I'm talking in general terms, but I think it is reflective of what we see in terms of lowering business confidence, in terms of businesses deferring investment or hiring decisions or cutting back in certain areas. And I think there is, the logical conclusion to that is there is strong support for a rules-based system. And as I was saying earlier, that rules-based system has probably been taken for granted for way too long. So I think that the key message from us, and we will certainly be mobilizing our network on that, is governments need to uphold, support, and commit to modernize the rules-based system. And I completely agree with you. I mean, why on earth, when you have an immense foundation in the form of the WTO, would you want to rip everything up, right? I mean, to say that everything is wrong with the system is completely incorrect from a business perspective, which, as Deb said, is really the ultimate proof point in terms of the utility of the system. But clearly there are areas that can be modernized. There are new approaches. As I was saying earlier, there are opportunities, we think, to better engage the business community in an appropriately structured way. And we want to make it clear to governments that now is the time to step up. And I think we take some heart from some of the historical analysis of the GATT, which says that often GATT rounds were successful when there was pressure in the system or concerns around protectionism or the European Union single market becoming overly protectionist. So maybe, as you were saying, Hamid, earlier, the position, the approach, the measures that have been taken by the US administration could be a shock to the system, which could hopefully create political conditions which are conducive to a proper recognition that rules-based commerce is imperative and essential for the real economy. And creates the political conditions that could be favourable for reform. I don't know whether I'm becoming overly optimistic after quite a turbulent year, but I really do hope I'm correct going into MC14, and we will mobilise all out to see what we can get governments to commit to in March.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I think you're doing a great job, and the future is on your shoulders. No pressure. But
Thanks, Hamid.
but I think this is really the time to buckle up and do what's necessary, and the call for action comes at a very timely point. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for all your support and collaboration with us, and for the opportunity to speak to this group today. We look forward to continuing the dialogue wherever we can be helpful.
By all means, by all means. Well, thank you so much once again. And if there are no further questions, then let me wrap this up here by thanking you again, Andrew. And this is a continuing process. So until next time, all the best. And
you soon.
Yeah. And Lou, would you like to say something to close this off, please?
No, there's just one quick word to Andrew that we appreciate, of course, very much, as Hamid said, that the interaction with the ICC, and in particular, the valuable kind of engagement by your colleague and ambassador here, Valerie Picard, who has always been active contributing to our work, and really appreciate that. Thanks a lot.
Good to hear. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.
Have a lovely evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.